Hello and welcome to another video in the course Ethics, Analytics, and the Duty of Care. We're still in Module 4, which is the study of ethical codes related to analytics and AI, but also related to other professions and other disciplinary groups. And of course, the objective of these ethical codes is to look at what they say and how they arrive at their ethical conclusions. In this video, we're looking specifically at what the bases are for the values and principles listed in these codes of ethics. That is to say, what we're after here is an understanding of what grounds these codes of ethics, on what basis their authors assert that this code of ethics, rather than some other code of ethics, is the code of ethics to follow. I should point out that in many cases, the codes of ethics don't offer any grounds at all, but where they do, they offer one or more of the types of bases that we'll be looking at in this video. So we're going to run through, again, like the format for many of the previous videos, a number of the different types. It's interesting, as we look at these bases, we might read an explanation, for example, something like, an individual's professional obligations are derived from the profession and its code, tradition, society's expectations, contracts, laws, and rules of ordinary morality. But when we look at this more closely, we find that this explanation or this description raises as many questions as it answers. So we're going to run through these one at a time and see what those questions are. So let's begin with the principle of universality. What we mean here is that the way the code is justified by the authors is that they assert that the principles embodied in the code are universal principles. That is to say, they are held by everyone. And arguably, if the principle is believed by everyone, then it should be believed here in this particular code of ethics. For example, the Universal Declaration of Ethical Principles for Psychologists asserts that these are, quote, based on shared human values. And later on it asserts, respect for the dignity of persons is the most fundamental and universally found ethical principle across geographical and cultural boundaries and across professional disciplines. So this is a pretty clear example of a case where universality is being asserted as a foundation for an underlying set of principles. The Asilomar Convention also states, for example, virtually all modern societies have strong traditions for protecting individuals in their interactions with large organizations. Norms of individual consent, privacy, and autonomy, for example, must be more vigilantly protected as the environments in which their holders reside are transformed by technology. So, again, we see a case where universality is a justification for a moral or ethical principle. Now, as I suggested in the previous video, the assertion that there is such a consensus, I think, is a bit misleading. We looked at what happens when we zero in more specifically and more in detail at what is meant by, say, accountability, and we find that it breaks down. While a large number of people may say accountability is a universal principle, what accountability actually means is something that varies from place to place, from discipline to discipline. And this isn't just my finding. There are other researchers, Maxwell and Schwimmer, for example, find that analysis did not reveal an overlapping consensus on teachers' ethical obligations. Campbell writes, despite extensive research on the ethical dimensions of teaching, scholars in the field do not appear to be any closer to agreement on, subquote, the moral essence of teacher professionalism. And similarly, Wilkinson argues that the teaching profession has failed to unite around any agreed set of transcendental values which it might serve. Van Newlen and Kendall report the model used for the codes varies greatly from country to country. So I think that although universality may be appealed to as a justification for these codes, it doesn't succeed. Another justification that we see referenced a lot is an appeal to fundamental rights, or as we might say, appeal to natural rights, or perhaps natural law. Diagrammed here is the John Finnis theory of natural law in moral reasoning, and as you can see from the diagram, we begin with a description of reality in some way. For example, the basic goods or the requirements of practical reason. And from that, we derive normative statements, that is to say, statements that instruct in the principles of ethics, or as the diagram here says, morally valid laws. This is an approach that a number of groups have taken. For example, the high-level expert group on artificial intelligence in Britain cites 4 ethical principles, quote, rooted in fundamental rights which must be respected in order to ensure that AI systems are developed, deployed, and used in a trustworthy manner. The Toronto Declaration also argues or focuses on the obligation to prevent machine learning systems from discriminating and in some cases violating existing human rights law. Access Now specifically adopts a human rights framework. The use of international human rights law and its well-developed standards and institutions to examine artificial intelligence systems can contribute to the conversations already happening and provide a universal vocabulary and forums established to address power differential. We see there is an overlap here between universality and natural rights, and that makes sense because if we think that rights are natural or fundamental, it stands to reason that they would also be universal. But there is a bit of a distinction here in the way this is argued. Sometimes natural rights can exist as a result of human activity, for example, the previous conversations that were already happening. Nonetheless, it's not clear what these fundamental rights are. Different efforts to list and describe these fundamental rights describe them differently. We have documents such as the United States Bill of Rights, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, for example, which are all very different from each other. Is it, for example, a natural right to bear arms? Is the right to an education, as found in the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights, is that a natural right? It seems that further argument would be required that these natural rights don't just reveal themselves to us. Ethical arguments in these codes of ethics often argue from a grounding in fact. And there are 2 ways in which this can come up. One is that there is a fact, which might be a law of nature or a description of a state of affairs, from which an ethical principle is derived. Alternatively, sometimes ethical principles are simply asserted to be facts. Either way, the determination of fact is used as a fundamental argument for the ethical principle in question. Now, there are some arguments that can be made about this argument as well. One is what is sometimes known as the is-ought problem. And it has its origins in David Hume, and very roughly stated, it says something like, you cannot derive an ought from an is. That is to say, the state of affairs in the world, however it may be, does not tell us in and of itself what is right and what is wrong. Now, Hume doesn't say that exactly, and he says that facts about the world need to be considered in context. They need to be observed, explained, and supported with reference to goals or requirements. So there's a lot of argument around that. Nonetheless, it's not clear that you can point to a state of affairs in the world, for example, what is natural for a human, and derive a moral principle out of that. Another consideration is that if we're looking at facts, the fact remains that facts do not really lead to moral values. Quote a study here, and you can see the diagram. While facts are raised a lot of the time, personal experiences bridge moral divides far better than facts. And that's an experience we see not just in questions of ethics, but in questions of the relation of reason and rationality to individual decision making generally. There are many cases in which facts do not convince people, do not sway their opinions. And this may be true not only in ethics, but in politics, in personal conduct, preferences, and more. So it's a fact. That fact does not inform morality. Very frequently in the ethical principles, we see reference to something like balancing risks and benefits. The AI for People Declaration makes that explicit. Quote, an ethical framework must be designed to maximize these opportunities, that is, these opportunities from AI, and minimize the related risks. There are many cases like this. The Concordat Working Group document on open data and the need to manage access, quote, in order to maintain confidentiality, protect individuals' privacy, respect consent terms, as well as managing security and other risks. So here we're balancing between the benefits of open and all the risks that are involved. The balancing of risks and benefit is a broadly consequentialist approach to ethics, and we'll be talking more about that in the next module. But for here, it's relevant to say that it results in a different calculation for each application. Each time you're looking at a specific balancing of risks and benefits, these risks and benefits show up in different ways and have different values. If we look at the risk and benefit map illustrated on the slide, we can see immediately that there are two important dimensions that must be considered for each. First of all, the likelihood of the risk or the benefit. It may be very unlikely or it may be very likely, and that's part of the calculation. And then as well, we need to take into account the severity of the risk and the significance of the benefit. So a risk that is very likely and very severe is something that it's kind of hard to trade off against. A benefit that is not very likely and not very significant also is very hard to trade off against. So we need this mapping of what the risks and the benefits actually are. And so that means that we need to know what is likely to happen if we implement AI and analytics in this way. And so that's not always able to be determined. As Rumsfeld says, there are unknown unknowns. We look at the House of Lords Select Committee on AI, which is recommending a consequentialist approach in its 2018 document. It states there is a need to be realistic about the public's ability to understand in detail how the technology works. And it's better to focus on the consequences of AI rather than the way it works. And to make that the way individuals are able to exercise their rights. But this might be unrealistic. If people don't understand how AI works, it seems hard to understand how they can understand what the consequences will be. It's probable that the understanding of the consequences will be determined as much by marketing as by actual projections of risk and benefit that could be obtained. Nonetheless, these factors are important. That's why we began this course with a look at the applications, that is, a detailed drawing out of what the benefits are, and a look at the risks, the detailed drawing out of what the issues are. Now, we didn't consider what the likelihood of each of these was because it was far beyond the ability of this course to make these projections. The standard we used was simply, does the benefit exist? Does the risk exist? Actually performing the calculation might be humanly impossible, although possibly an artificial intelligence could do it. And then finally, perhaps ethics isn't actually a case of balancing competing interests. Economics might be, politics might be, but ethics strikes us as something different from that. What we're after is something that works for everybody. We depict a lot of these ethical issues as competing interests, but perhaps what we want to do is find what works for both sides. The Information and Privacy Commissioner in Ontario takes this approach, asserting that, quote, a positive-sum approach to designing a regulatory framework governing state surveillance can avoid false dichotomies and unnecessary trade-offs, demonstrating that it is indeed possible to have both public safety and personal privacy. We can and must have both effective law enforcement and rigorous privacy protections. And that sounds like more of an approach based in the ethics of the situation than a calculation and a weighing of consequences. Another argument that comes up fairly frequently is that a certain stance on ethics exists as a requirement of the profession. For example, again, we come back to the Universal Declaration of Ethical Principles for Psychologists, which states that competent caring for the well-being of persons and peoples involves working for their benefit and, above all, doing no harm. It requires the application of knowledge and skills that are appropriate for the nature of the situation as well as the social and cultural context. So, this is basically a derivation of ethical principles which are depicted as a requirement for what somebody needs to believe from an ethical perspective in order to accomplish a certain objective or a certain goal. So the objectives or the goals might be healing people, it might be supporting them when they're on welfare, it might be attending to their psychological needs, it might be teaching them. All of these professions have a certain objective or goal. And in order to achieve that goal, certain attitudes and beliefs may be required. And so the statement of ethics is a listing of these attitudes and beliefs that may be required. We see, for example, arguments like the IFLA, or the Librarian Association, saying integrity is vital to the advancement of scientific knowledge and to the maintenance of public confidence in the discipline of psychology. We see, for example, integrity itself being based on honesty and on truthful, open, and accurate communication. So we can sort of back up our way through the requirements of the profession. If we look at the diagram on the slide, we see that what this does is it places a code of ethics, and presumably ethics generally, within the context of a wider model of a profession. Here we have a model of an IT profession from the IEEE Computer Society, and we see the standards of ethical practice, and we see the mechanisms for self-governance and consensus, and these defined professional advancement. In turn, we also have mechanisms for professional development, studying and applying the knowledge, as well as the preparatory education that's required, the body of knowledge, curriculum, accreditation, and degrees, certifications, or licensing. All of these together constitute the profession, and they don't all flow from the code of ethics. Rather, there's a relation between these elements where the goals, the objectives, the training flow back into the ethics, and the ethics inform the training. It's kind of a symbiotic relationship. Now, the principles in this way may be expressed in two ways. First of all, a principle might be derived. That is to say, it's a consequence of an already defined ethical principle. For example, competent caring for the well-being of persons and peoples is one of the requirements of the profession, but it's previously established that working for the benefit of the people who you're serving is already established. So you see, we have working for their benefit, and then from that follows competent caring. And we can trace back similar requirements. We look at the principle of integrity, which is established on the previously established value of honesty and openness and accuracy. The second way a principle can be established is that it's conditional. And we see this expressed in a number of these codes of ethics. And what that means is that the ethical principle and the relation to the profession is described as a conditional statement. Something like this: if you wish to be a member of this profession, then you need to adhere to the following principles. So, as you can see, it's a conditional statement. And so, for example, if one is engaged in the activity of competent caring for the well-being of people, then this requires working for their benefit. So, arguably, against such assertions, several objections may be brought forward. First of all, you can say that the requirement doesn't actually follow. For example, you might argue that in order to be a competent psychologist, you do not need to be honest and open. Sometimes deception is required. You could argue perhaps that competent caring does not require working for the person's benefit. It might actually require you distancing yourself from the idea of the benefit of the person and simply following the appropriate practices and procedures. You might also say that the antecedent hasn't been established, that it's not actually a property of the profession. For example, we might say that being a psychologist doesn't involve caring at all. And in fact, I remember listening on NPR a number of months ago now, it was while I was bikepacking last summer, a discussion on how the best psychologist might be one who is psychopathic, who is actually incapable of caring for the patient and therefore immune to the bias that might be created by caring for them. A criminal psychologist might take this stance, for example. Another principle commonly appealed to as a justification for an ethical code is the social good or social order. We see this most clearly in journalistic ethics, which states that, for example, the primary function of journalism is to inform the public and serve the truth because, as the Society for Professional Journalists says, public enlightenment is the forerunner of justice and the foundation of democracy. And similarly, we may see additional principles brought forward to the effect that if we perform this profession properly, then society as a whole benefits. Or perhaps society as a whole benefits directly from the practice of these ethical virtues. We might see that, for example, in a teacher code of ethics where the teacher serves as a model for the student, and therefore they're not teaching ethics particularly, but the way they conduct themselves ethically is directly reflected in the way society conducts itself ethically. An argument from social good or social order, however, invites relativism. People's judgments are relative. People's support is highly context-driven. People consider acceptability to preserve the social good or the social order on a case-by-case basis. Drew writes that they're first thinking about overall policy goals, likely intended outcome, and then weighing up privacy and unintended consequences. The relativism is clear from statements like this: better that a few innocent people are a bit cross at being stopped than a terror interest because terrorist incident, try that once more, than a terrorist incident because lives are at risk. And often this relativism reflects the society in question's own interests. And very often social order can be construed specifically in terms of national interests, and therefore not thinking about, say, a global social order or even a community social order at all. We see policy in countries all around the world, like the one from the Office of Management and Budget in the United States, which seeks as ethical principles to support the U.S. approach on free markets, federalism, and good regulatory practices, which has led to a robust innovation ecosystem. So here, the social order is being defined in a very specific way. But it's not clear that the social order as defined by Americans, or as defined by the Chinese, or as defined by Brazilians, is the social order that provides the ethical basis necessary for a code of ethics. We also see fairness appealed to frequently, often with no support or justification. And so the ethics of a profession is based in fairness, full stop. The New York Times, for example, in its own code says that it wants to treat its readers as fairly and openly as possible, and also that it treats news sources just as fairly and openly as it treats readers. Now, we could argue about whether it's successful in this, but what's indisputable is that it is making an appeal to fairness as a justification for its ethical code. The problem is, what is fairness? On the slide here, I've listed 4 possible ways of describing fairness. This is not a complete list, I am quite sure. One way we could think of as fairness is objectivity, free from any whiff of bias. Arguably, however, fairness might involve advocacy. Fairness to others is seen as something that is non-arbitrary, citing the original codes of Solon, the idea that the same principle or law or rule is applied to all equally. It's the idea that nobody is above the law. Another definition of fairness might be based in rights, where something is fair if and only if it leaves people free from abuse and infringement of their rights. Yet another definition of fairness talks about equitable and non-discriminatory practices. I was going to put in that little diagram that shows the difference between equal and equitable, but it's been so overused. Instead, I put in a document from the LinkedIn Fairness Toolkit, which I just recently saw, talking about how to measure fairness in large-scale AI applications. And here we see that actually thinking about what constitutes fairness in a complex discipline like analytics and AI is far from straightforward. What does it mean to be objective, non-arbitrary, or equitable in the context of AI and analytics? There are ways of defining data classes, there are ways of defining algorithms, computer models, permutations, different principles of regression, customization, etc., that can all have an impact on what we think is fairness. So it's not clear that fairness, without a further explanation, can serve as the basis for a code of ethics. Epistemology is another principle that is frequently cited. There are two major ways to think of this when we think that the advancement of knowledge and learning being considered to be in and of itself a moral good. First of all, we might say that a value becomes a value if it supports knowledge and truth-seeking. A good example of this is honesty. One of the reasons why we want people to be honest is because it makes it possible to learn things, to know things, and find out the truth. Another way of thinking about it is to say that an ethical decision, which may or may not appeal to one of these moral principles, is ethical if, and sometimes only if, it is informed by knowledge and evidence. So in other words, we use knowledge and evidence as the basis for our moral reasoning, if not the basis for our moral principles. Now, it's not clear that this also works as a basis for ethical codes. First of all, we could simply deny that knowledge and learning are moral goods. It's nice that people want to know things and learn things, but they are not in and of themselves ethical values. We might say with Seneca, for example, that this desire to know more than is sufficient is a sort of intemperance. You can know or want to know too much. Or we, in slogan form today, we say something like, curiosity killed the cat. Alternatively, we can say that some things are not meant to be known. It would have been better, arguably, had we not learned how to create atomic weapons. This would have been a piece of knowledge we were better off not knowing. So, more often, we see the responses based in epistemology to be couched in very specific terms, not just knowledge in general, but some specific piece of knowledge. So knowledge related to advanced weapons or personal confidentiality or a host of other harms is wrong, but other kinds of knowledge like scientific principles, or even what is the good, these are inherently good. But now we have not a value of epistemology underlying our moral code. We have a value picking somehow between good knowledge and bad knowledge. Another basis for moral codes that we see fairly frequently is trust. And as a result, the elements of trust in themselves can be cited as justification for moral principles. Again, we come back to the psychologists who say integrity is vital to the maintenance of public confidence in the discipline of psychology. For psychology to work, it requires trust. And so for psychology to embody trust, it must adhere to a certain set of ethical principles. Well, what are those principles? Here we have a trust model that is frequently used that combines 5 major features of trust: credibility, respect, pride, camaraderie, and fairness. So the argument here then would be that all 5 of these as components of trust justify treating trust as a virtue. But of course, these components of trust are also things that result from trust. Fairness, for example, arguably requires trust. So does camaraderie. So it's not the case that one of these things supports the other in a form of inference or moral reasoning, but rather that these things are all involved together into something a bit more amorphous. A lot of the time it's a direct appeal to the reputation of the discipline that requires trust. The New York Times asserts the reputation of the Times rests on such perceptions, and so do the professional reputations of its staff members. Here, public confidence is being represented as an aspect of trust, and we see that the authors are appealing to the principle of trust to support the assertion that integrity is a moral principle, although integrity might also be a component of trust. So, how does this work? Well, it could be argued that trust is neither good or bad in itself. Arguably, and I've seen it argued, it would be better for certain professions to work on a trustless system rather than a trust-based system. Why might this be the case? Well, for one thing, trust is very fragile. It can be broken even if you're not attempting to break it. It can be broken as a result of honest error, as a result of misperceptions, bad timing, any number of things. The moral superiority of trustless systems is that they are more reliable and more robust. And you might think, well, how can you have a trustless system? Well, this is the basis for technologies like cryptography, zero-knowledge proofs, and systems like blockchain. These are mechanisms where the relations between entities are completely defined by the technology, such that you don't need to take a leap of faith in order for the interaction to occur. Now, it's not clear that this is going to work in all disciplines. It's hard to imagine a trustless approach in psychology, or even a trustless approach in teaching and learning. But it might be the case that a trustless approach is the best approach when it comes to the ethics of artificial intelligence and analytics. One more justification for an ethical code is the defensibility of a practice. Now, what this means is that the ethical value or the ethical practice is virtuous if it's the sort of principle that you would be willing to defend, or even more to the point, that you would be willing to defend if somebody else did it and you were asked to defend that practice. We see this a lot in professional associations where one member needs to come forward to the defense of the other. We also see this in academic environments where we look to faculty associations or even university administrations to come to the defense of their professors and staff members' actions. So there are some actions that these professors are going to undertake, like, for example, murder, which are probably not going to be defended by the university or the faculty association. On the other hand, if they exercise their freedom of speech, for example, in acting as an expert witness in a trial, this action is typically one that would be expected to be defended by the administration or the staff association. And so this principle, which, it makes one think of Frank Ramsey's subjective defense of probability, or subjectivist interpretation of probability, where the probability of an event taking place is established by how much you would be willing to bet on the event taking place. This is a similar sort of thing. Would you be willing to put your organization's reputation on the line in defense of this principle? So this has several aspects. One is related to the cost of such a defense. There might be a large moral or even financial cost to the defense, and that makes it less likely that someone is going to defend it. It might relate to the work of one's predecessors. Defending something that was a hard-won freedom by the pioneers of the association is probably going to be more likely to be defended than something that's a relatively recent and less well-established principle. So we here have a type of argument for an ethical code which is almost definitively a relativistic approach. It is based on the subjective preferences of the members of the profession, given the circumstances. It's also based on what society as a whole thinks of it, because that will have an impact on the cost or the difficulty of making such a defense. But we see this, for example, when we're looking at the ethics of federal agencies, government agencies. So, for example, we might see them urged to consider patient, provider, and system burden in the evaluation of AI benefits and costs, and include data accuracy, validity, and reliability. All of these things together are brought forward to offer a statement in terms of defensibility of a practice or of a principle. And that leads us to a final consideration of what we think we're doing with any of these arguments at all. Now, off the top of this presentation, I said that the ethical principles in question in ethical codes sometimes aren't argued for at all. And that's quite true. Sometimes they're taken as self-evident. Sometimes they're just simply stated, and there's no statement at all about how true or not true they are. On the other hand, there is this idea of moral reasoning. And the idea of moral reasoning is that we want to have a process that allows us to come to correct moral decisions. So here we have, for example, from the United Kingdom Statistics Authority, an ethics self-assessment for data management and data ethics. And it raises several questions for us. One is to draw the distinction between ethical value and ethical principle as between checklists, have you considered all of these things, and process, have you gone through a process of inference. There's another distinction here between conforming to a standard, which is what a checklist would support, as opposed to creating one, which a checklist doesn't support at all. There is also the distinction between sorry about that, a live presentation. There's a distinction between consideration of ethical issues before drafting your code or conducting your practice, and rationalization of what you've been doing all along after the fact. And then finally, in moral reasoning, there are questions about the standards of evidence, what counts as a moral reason, and forms of argument. Is an inductive argument good enough, or does it have to be deductive? Would the Hegelian method of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis work as well? It's not clear that there's only one method of moral reasoning, and therefore only one way to reach an output of your moral reasoning process. A really good example of that is counterfactual reasoning. Now, a lot of moral reasoning is based on counterfactuals because it's based on predicting consequences where something hasn't happened yet. Counterfactually reasoning is notoriously difficult, and it's often based in the logic of modality. What could be the case as opposed to what must be the case. And we bring in other modalities like probability, what is likely to happen, and deontology, what should happen. And the question is, well, how do we say something is most likely to happen? Or even, how do we establish the truth of a counterfactual at all? If a train has no brakes, then it will probably crash. Now, that's a counterfactual statement. It's counterfactual because, in fact, all trains have brakes. Why? Because they would be dangerous, right? But how do we know that? We could appeal to a natural law or principle, but there are no natural laws or principles about brakeless trains. It's just too specific a case. And we can imagine cases where brakeless trains are not dangerous. If we look at the logic of the movie Snowpiercer, you don't want brakes on those trains because if they stop, everybody dies. So how do you do this? Well, people like Stoneacker and David K. Lewis have developed a semantics of counterfactuals based on probable world or possible worlds. And what you do is you select the nearest possible world to our own and ask yourself what is true in that world. But that just pushes back the question, because what counts as the nearest possible world to our own? Presumably not the world of Snowpiercer, but maybe it is a world where your trains only ever go 10 miles an hour and you jump off and jump onto them as they pass through the station, and thus they don't need brakes. So moral reasoning, because it involves all of these sorts of considerations, is an area fraught with difficulty. And we come back to whether we can just create a checklist or just rationalize our existing process, or the question of whether we can, by thinking about it, maybe not seeking a universal consensus, because not everybody is going to be swayed by facts. Not everybody is going to be swayed by argument. But perhaps, the thinking goes, we can sit down, we can think about it as rational, reasonably well-informed people, and come up with principles of morality that will support moral reasoning generally, that will allow us to draw the sorts of conclusions that we want to draw, which lead us to our codes of ethics and our ethical practices generally. So that's the segue to the next module. The next module is on moral principles or moral theories generally. What people have thought about ethics through history. And so we'll be looking at some of the different major ethical theories. We'll look at meta-ethics, or what considerations lead us to favor one approach or another of determining ethical theories. And we'll look at some of the discussion around all of these issues. So with that, we'll leave off Module 4 and start getting ready for Module 5. I'm Stephen Downs. Thanks once again for joining me.